The cafe was small, tucked between two aging buildings on a quiet corner of the city, the kind of place that smelled of fresh bread and old wood. It wasn't the sort of place a billionaire like Ethan Graves usually visited. His world was one of polished glass towers, private jets, and fine dining, where coffee was served by assistants, not baristas. But that afternoon, after a long meeting and a longer silence in his car, he had wanted something simple. He stepped into the cafe wearing his tailored suit, drawing a few curious glances from the workers and customers. He ordered a black coffee, no sugar, and chose a seat by the window, where the drizzle outside streaked against the glass like quiet thoughts. He opened his laptop, intending to review numbers that already bored him, when the bell above the door rang again. A boy stood there barefoot, thin, his clothes clinging to him from the cold. The chatter in the cafe dimmed. Some people frowned, others turned away. The barista sighed, ready to tell him to leave, but the boy didn't move. He wasn't begging or asking for food. His wide, frightened eyes were locked on one thing, the cup of coffee on Ethan's table. Ethan noticed the stare and raised an eyebrow. He thought maybe the child was hungry, so he gestured for the waiter. But before he could speak, the boy took a few hesitant steps forward, his lips trembling. Then, in a voice that cut through the room, he shouted, "Sir, don't drink that." The cafe froze. Chairs stopped creaking. The waiter nearly dropped a tray. Ethan blinked, startled. Everyone's attention swung toward the little boy who now stood shaking near the counter, his face pale but determined. "What did you say?" Ethan asked, his deep voice calm but sharp. The boy looked like he might run, but didn't. "Don't drink it," he repeated, louder this time, his voice echoing off the walls. For a second, no one knew what to do. A man in a business suit laughed nervously. "It's just a kid," he said. "Ignore him." But Ethan didn't move. His instincts, the same ones that had helped him build an empire, told him something was off. Slowly, he set the cup down and studied it. The barista rushed to the boy's side, whispering for him to leave before he caused trouble. "Please," the boy said again, glancing at Ethan. "I saw someone near your table. They put something in it." The cafe filled with uneasy murmurs. Ethan frowned, glancing around. The seats behind him were empty now. Whoever had been there before was gone. He gestured to the manager. "Bring me the security footage," he ordered, his voice low and commanding. The boy's chest rose and fell quickly as he clutched the edge of the counter, his small frame trembling but his eyes steady. Minutes later, the staff crowded around a screen behind the counter. Ethan joined them, his expression unreadable. The grainy footage showed a man in a dark coat sitting behind Ethan's table minutes earlier. When the waiter turned away, the man leaned forward and poured something from a small vial into the coffee. Then he left, disappearing out of frame. A collective gasp swept the cafe. The manager covered her mouth in horror. Ethan stared at the screen for a long, silent moment. His pulse quickened, not from fear, but from realization. The boy had saved his life. Slowly, Ethan turned toward him. The child stood awkwardly, drenched from the rain that had followed him in, his small hands twisting nervously. "What's your name?" Ethan asked. The boy hesitated, then whispered, "Leo." Ethan nodded once. "Thank you, Leo." The cafe workers looked at each other in disbelief. A billionaire, thanking a homeless boy. But to Ethan, none of that mattered. As the rain tapped against the windows, he realized that the richest man in the room wasn't the one with the money. It was the one who had cared enough to shout. The room felt like it had frozen in time. For a few long seconds, no one moved, no one spoke. Only the soft hum of the cafe's air conditioner filled the silence. The boy stood trembling near the counter, his bare feet leaving small, wet marks on the floor. "Don't drink it," he repeated, louder this time, his voice carrying a mix of fear and certainty. The waiter, flustered and embarrassed, hurried toward him. "Hey, You can't just come in here yelling things like that, he said, grabbing the boy by the arm. But the child didn't back down. Please, don't drink it, he pleaded, looking directly at Ethan. Something's wrong. Ethan, who was halfway through picking up his cup, paused. His sharp, business-trained instincts told him there was more to this than a child's outburst. The manager, a woman in her 40s, stepped forward to calm things down. Sir, I'm so sorry, she said, her voice shaky. It's just a child trying to get attention. The coffee is perfectly safe. I'll prove it. Before Ethan could respond, she took the cup from his table, lifted it, and took a quick sip. The next few seconds were chaos. The woman's face went pale, her hands shaking violently, before she collapsed to the floor, the cup shattering beside her. Gasps and screams erupted across the cafe. Someone shouted to call an ambulance. Another ran to the counter for help. Ethan froze, the shock hitting him like a wave. He knelt beside the manager as the waiter panicked, trying to wake her. She was breathing, but barely. The bitter smell of coffee mixed with something metallic hung in the air. What just happened? Someone cried. The boy stepped forward, voice trembling but firm. I told you, he said quietly. Someone put something in the drink. His small frame looked even smaller among the towering adults, but his courage filled the room. Ethan turned toward him, eyes narrowing. How do you know that? The boy pointed to the far corner of the cafe. I saw him, a man in a black jacket. He came in before you, and when you went to pay, he poured something from a small bottle into your cup. Ethan followed the direction of the boy's finger. The seat was empty now. The man had disappeared. A chill ran down his spine. Did anyone see him leave? He demanded, but the crowd just exchanged uneasy looks. The boy bit his lip, trying to hold back tears. I tried to stop him, he said, but when I shouted, he ran. Ethan's heart pounded. He could hardly believe what was unfolding, but one thing was certain, the child had just saved his life. Within minutes, sirens wailed outside as paramedics rushed in. The manager was carried out on a stretcher, her pulse faint but steady. A police officer began taking statements. Ethan sat down slowly, running a hand over his face. Everything about his day, his wealth, his power, his control, suddenly felt meaningless. The officer questioned the boy gently, jotting down his words. You saw this man clearly, he asked. The boy nodded. I remember his face. Ethan looked at him, at his thin frame, torn clothes, and shaking hands. What's your name? He asked softly. Leo, the boy said. Ethan's voice was quiet but steady. You saved my life, Leo. The officer confirmed later that the coffee had been poisoned with a slow-acting toxin. One sip could have been fatal. The suspect, they believed, was connected to a recent business deal gone wrong, a man fired from one of Ethan's companies. As the truth sank in, Ethan felt something he hadn't felt in years. Vulnerability. The billionaire who thought he was untouchable had been spared by a child no one cared to notice. As the police took statements and reporters began to gather outside, Ethan turned back to Leo. Why did you help me? He asked. Leo looked up, his eyes tired but sincere. Because someone helped me once, he said simply, and I didn't want you to die. In that moment, Ethan realized that heroism didn't come from money, power, or fame. It came from compassion, from the courage to speak up when no one else would. The boy who had been ignored by the world had just reminded him of what it meant to be truly alive. The cafe buzzed with police activity, the air thick with tension and disbelief. The once cozy space now felt like a crime scene, because it was. Officers moved swiftly, questioning witnesses, gathering fingerprints, and sealing off the area where the poisoned coffee still sat untouched on the table. Ethan Graves, a man who usually commanded every room he entered, now sat quietly. His expensive suit wrinkled, his mind spinning. Just a few feet away sat the boy who had saved his life, small, soaked, and silent. His name, the officers learned, was Leo. He was only 11 years old and had been living on the streets for months. Leo told them he had been near the cafe's trash bins, collecting empty bottles to trade for a little money, when he noticed something strange. A man in a gray suit, Leo explained, his voice shaky but steady, walked in before Mr. Graves came. He looked nervous. When the waiter turned away, he took out a small glass bottle and poured something white into the coffee cup. The officer, taking notes, frowned. "You're sure about that?" Leo nodded. "I saw him clearly. He had a scar on his cheek." One of the police officers went to check the cafe's security footage. Minutes later, the video confirmed everything. The man Leo described was seen entering, waiting briefly, and then leaning over Ethan's table. He poured something into the cup, glanced around, and left before Ethan even sat down. The image sent a chill through everyone watching, especially Ethan. The face on the screen wasn't unfamiliar. It belonged to a man named Henry Clark, a former senior employee at one of Ethan's companies. He had been fired months earlier for embezzling funds, and Ethan had personally pressed charges. The betrayal had cost Henry everything: his career, his home, his reputation. And now, it seemed, he wanted revenge. As the truth sank in, Ethan looked at the little boy across the room, this homeless child who had no reason to care, no reason to interfere, but had done so anyway. Leo sat hunched in a chair, his small hands gripping the edge of his tattered coat, too shy to meet anyone's eyes. "You saved my life," Ethan said quietly, walking over. Leo glanced up, unsure how to respond. "I just didn't want you to die," he whispered. "You didn't deserve that." The simplicity of the boy's words hit Ethan harder than any speech ever could. Reporters had begun to gather outside, sensing a story that would make headlines: "Homeless boy saves billionaire from poisoning." But inside the cafe, it didn't feel like news. It felt personal. The boy who had nothing had saved the man who had everything. One of the officers came over to confirm the details. "Mr. Graves," he said, "you were lucky. A few more minutes, and you might not have survived. The substance was lethal." Ethan nodded, but his eyes stayed on Leo. "It wasn't luck," he said softly. "It was him." The officer smiled faintly. "Then I'd say you owe him more than a thank you." As the investigation continued, Ethan insisted Leo be cared for. He ordered the staff to bring him food and a blanket. Watching the boy eat, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling of irony. The world had forgotten this child, yet he had just saved the man the world admired. For the first time in years, Ethan felt small, humbled. He had built an empire on power and intellect, but it was kindness, not strength, that had saved him. And as the night wore on and police cars pulled away, one thought stayed with him. Sometimes, the greatest lessons come from those with nothing to give but their heart. Rain poured softly against the car windows as Ethan drove through the quiet city streets, his thoughts heavy. The flashing lights of the police station faded behind him, but the image of the small boy sitting alone under those bright cold lamps refused to leave his mind. Leo sat beside him now, wrapped in a blanket the officers had given him, staring silently at the lights passing by. His eyes looked too old for a boy his age, eyes that had seen too much hunger, too much loneliness. When Ethan pulled over at a diner, Leo hesitated before following him inside, as if unsure he was really allowed. Ethan ordered 2 hot meals, something simple, soup and bread, but when the food arrived, Leo ate like he hadn't had a proper meal in days. Ethan watched quietly, guilt twisting in his chest. How many times had he driven past children like him without even looking? How many times had he thought that his success, his endless meetings, and his luxury were more important than understanding people's pain? After a while, he asked softly, "Where are your parents, Leo?" The boy froze, his spoon halfway to his mouth. "My mom," he began, voice cracking. "She died 2 years ago. She got sick, and I couldn't help her." He stared down at his bowl, fingers trembling. "And your father?" Ethan asked gently. He left after she died. I don't know where he went. There was no anger in Leo's tone, just a quiet acceptance that came from having no choice but to survive. He went on to explain how he lived near the old subway tunnels, collecting bottles and cans to buy scraps of food. I watch people, he said, his voice low but steady. It's how I stay safe. You can tell when someone's good or bad if you look long enough. Ethan sat in stunned silence, the weight of the boy's words settling deep in his heart. This child, abandoned and unseen, had learned the rules of life through pain, the same world that had celebrated. Ethan's name had turned its back on Leo. He felt something shift inside him, a realization that all his money and power meant nothing if he had forgotten how to care. When they finished eating, Ethan placed a hand on the boy's shoulder. You're coming with me, he said firmly. Leo's eyes widened in surprise. To a shelter? He asked, unsure. Ethan smiled faintly. No, somewhere better. The drive to his mansion was quiet, except for the soft sound of rain. When the gates opened, Leo's mouth fell open in awe. The enormous house glowed with warm lights, its marble floors shining like mirrors. He hesitated at the doorway, afraid to step inside. It's okay, Ethan said. You're safe here. The butler looked shocked when his employer walked in with a soaked, barefoot child, but Ethan waved away the questions. Prepare a room, he ordered, and bring some clothes. As Leo was led upstairs, still wide-eyed and speechless, Ethan stood in the grand hallway, staring at his reflection in the glass. For the first time in years, he didn't see a powerful man. He saw someone who had been blind to suffering, blind to humanity. But that night, because of a boy who had nothing, Ethan's heart began to open again. Weeks passed, and Ethan's world no longer revolved around stock reports or board meetings. It revolved around Leo. The boy who once had no home now had his own room, small but full of warmth, laughter, and new beginnings. His shelves were lined with books Ethan had personally chosen, his closet filled with clean clothes, and his desk with pencils and drawings of dreams too long suppressed. Each morning, Ethan made sure Leo had breakfast before school, something he had never done for anyone. Each night, he'd ask about his day, truly listening, something he hadn't done in years. It was strange at first, the great billionaire sitting beside a child doing homework. But soon it became the best part of his day. The cold, echoing mansion had come alive again. The staff adored Leo, often sneaking him desserts or helping him study. And even Ethan's closest business partners noticed the change in him. He smiled more, spoke softer, and for the first time, seemed genuinely happy. But Ethan's transformation didn't stop at home. What happened that day in the cafe haunted him, not the poison, not the danger, but the thought that he had once been blind to the people who needed him most. He couldn't forget Leo's trembling voice shouting, "Don't drink that." It wasn't just a warning that saved his life. It was a message that woke something deep inside him. So, he made a decision that stunned everyone. He stepped down from several of his company's boards and created a foundation dedicated to helping homeless children. If one boy could save me, he told the press, how many more could we save if we actually cared? The media called it the Graves redemption, but to Ethan, it wasn't redemption, it was purpose. He visited shelters every week, not as a billionaire with cameras, but as a man who finally understood pain. He talked to children, helped fund their education, and personally oversaw every program. And each time he saw a child smile, he thought of Leo, the boy who taught him what no money ever could, that compassion is the greatest form of wealth. Meanwhile, Leo thrived in school. Teachers were amazed by his intelligence and humility. When someone asked how he managed to adapt so quickly, he simply said, "Someone believed in me." That line would echo in Ethan's heart for years. Months later, when a journalist asked Ethan what inspired his sudden change, he smiled and said, Because one homeless boy saved my life. The headlines spread everywhere, touching hearts across the country. Donations poured in, not because people admired the billionaire, but because they believed in the power of kindness. Ethan knew he couldn't change the past, the years he had wasted chasing numbers, instead of meaning, but he could make the future count. He had learned that real success wasn't measured by profit margins or properties, but by lives touched and hearts changed. Every night, before turning in, Ethan would stop by Leo's room. Sometimes the boy was asleep, curled under soft blankets, and other times he'd be reading with a small lamp on. Ethan would stand in the doorway, smiling quietly. He often thought of how one moment, one child's courage had rewritten both their destinies. That fateful warning, "Don't drink that," had not only saved his life, but had also awakened his soul. In the end, it wasn't just a poor boy who was rescued from the streets. It was a billionaire who was rescued from himself. And together, they proved that sometimes, the smallest act of kindness can spark the greatest change.